This is the United States of America, and this is the Gulf Coast, home to some of America's busiest seaports. In our previous episode, we looked at seaports within Tampa Bay, including other ports in Florida such as Panama City and Pensacola. We then traveled to Mobile and ended our trip in Pascagoula. The journey continued as we headed to the port of Gulfport, the port of New Orleans, and the port of South Louisiana, as well as the unique port of Port Fourchon. We ended up closing the second episode by visiting the port of Lake Charles, the port of Port Arthur, and the port of Beaumont. The adventure continues as we continue to look at seaports deeper into the state of Texas. And by the time we're done, we'll have rounded out all the seaports along the Gulf Coast. And while you're aboard, be sure to like, subscribe, and comment below. We also have a Patreon. This is Seaports of the Gulf Coast, Episode 3. Being one of the oldest ports west of New Orleans, the port of Galveston has a lot of history. It was established in 1825 by the Congress of Mexico, because at the time, Texas was still a part of Mexico. The port started out primarily as a cotton port, but over the years the port expanded to include grain. In the late 1800s, it was considered one of the busiest ports in the United States. But as industrialization took control of the American economy, the port's agricultural base began to decline. Wealthy residents left and the city's economy stagnated. So why exactly did the port struggle with its great location? There were many factors. First of all, it was located on an island, so once the products were shipped to the island, they still had to get off the island, and this was done by rickety old railway bridges. Another was that the entire city itself lacked an adequate water system, and they were also prone to floods. Flooding from hurricanes took its toll on the port for many years, not to mention the damage from the hurricanes, which often ruined the port's infrastructure, such as its only access to the mainland via railroad bridges. Prior to 1939, all rail and auto traffic shared a bridge. But probably the most devastating blow to the port of Galveston and the city itself was Houston. The Port of Houston did everything Galveston did, but better. Industry and investors flocked to Houston while Galveston slowly faded away. Today, the port is still an important port that handles dry and liquid bulk, break bulk, project cargoes, container cargo, and more. They also have a thriving cruise industry which finally came in the year 2000. They are currently expanding cruise facilities and will soon be home to the third largest cruise ship in the world, the Allure of the Seas. In all, they moved about 4.1 million tons of goods and had almost 2 million cruise passengers this past year alone. Strategically, the port seems like it is in an advantageous spot, being only 9.3 miles from the open sea, and quicker access than Houston. But it is also due to its location, limitations, and constant hurricane threat that Galveston isn't the key port it once was. Opposite of Galveston is the port of Texas City. Once one of the most prominent seaports in Texas, today it holds an explosive story of its past. The city was founded in 1893 and was immediately prepped by the railroad and various companies to set up a seaport. A few different dredging projects took place in the early 1900s and seaport activity skyrocketed. This was thanks to the refineries that started to sprout up along the city's waterfront. In 1910, they had 239 ships call on the port, as opposed to just 12 in 1904. In 1913, during the peak of the Mexican Revolution, the U.S. Army deployed Army personnel to the city and the port in case the Mexican Revolution spilled over across its borders. There were also worries that Germany might ally with Mexico during the First World War. By 1940, Texas City was the fourth largest port in Texas, behind Houston, Beaumont, and Port Arthur. 1947 was the year of the Texas City disaster. April 16th, the French ship known as Grand Camp exploded. The ship was loaded with ammonium nitrate fertilizer, and when it ignited, it instantly wiped out the ship, the docks, warehouses, offices, and any people nearby. As the Grand Camp exploded, it ignited the SS Flyer parked nearby, which was also loaded with ammonium nitrate fertilizer, and it too exploded, taking out the port's offices and the port's fire department. The explosions were so massive that people in Galveston felt the blast 14 miles away across the bay. The Texas City disaster killed at least 581 people and injured over 5,000 people in a city of roughly 10,000. It became known as the largest industrial disaster ever in the history of the United States. Other notable events for the port was a hydrogen fluoride gas release in 1987 that required over 3,000 people to be evacuated. As well, there was an explosion at the BP oil refinery in 2015 that killed 15 and injured 180. Today, the port is still a significant seaport in the state, moving over 47 million tons of goods, making it fall within the top 20 busiest seaports in the United States. The Texas City Rail Terminal, owned by the BNSF and Union Pacific, provides 32 miles of track and services to the port's many petrochemical companies. The port itself has 2 barge fleeting areas and berths for up to 35 cargo ships. Despite all the disasters of the past, the Port of Texas City remains a powerful port not only in Texas, but within the entire Gulf region. The Port of Houston, or now known as Port Houston, centers around the Houston Ship Channel, which is a 50-mile-long complex of over 150 private companies. It is one of the busiest ports in the United States and the busiest port in the USA in terms of foreign tonnage moved. The primary occupants are tied to the petroleum industry, so on both sides of the channel you will see refineries and petrochemical plants from the largest companies in the world. In fact, the largest petrochemical plant in the world is located within the port. When originally created, the port was within the Houston city limits, but over the years it has expanded so much it goes through multiple different cities. By the end of the 1800s, the port was starting to compete with Galveston in terms of shipping traffic. Galveston took a devastating blow in 1900 due to a hurricane, and Houston capitalized on it. Houston grew after this hurricane as many saw Houston's more protected inland position a better place to do business. They dredged the current Houston Ship Channel in 1911. Houston opened their first container port in 1977 at Morgan's Point, and another new terminal opened in 2006 known as the Bayport Terminal. Over 3 million TEUs moved through Houston's 2 container terminals. As of 2022, it was the 7th busiest container port in the country and the largest overall in Texas. Of the 276 million short tons moved at the port in 2022, most of it is tied to the petroleum industry. Also in 2022, the port invested $1.1 billion in infrastructure improvements around the port, which it will spend over the next 5 years. The port is determined to continue to be a major seaport in not only the Gulf or the United States, but the entire world. One of the fastest growing ports in America is Port Freeport, at the mouth of the Brazos River. Geographically, it is the smallest deepwater port in the Gulf, but it hits way above its beltline. It is in the top 20 for total tonnage moved in the United States and home to 14 ship berths. It has post-Panamax cranes and soon will have a 55-foot deep channel leading to the port. It is also the 10th biggest port in the country for chemicals, with over 1,000 ships calling on the port each year. Petrochemicals, liquefied natural gas, crude oil, and automobiles are major commodities coming to and from the port. Annually, they move over 100,000 cars. In the past, there have been many attempts to use this port as a location, as early as the 1860s. The issue was that there would need to be a lot of improvements before ships could call on the port. The first official port was the Port of Alaska, which would later merge with Freeport and become the Port of Freeport. Speaking of which, Port Freeport was officially created in 1925. Early shipping products were sulfur and other mined goods. It wasn't until World War II that the growth of the chemical and petroleum industry began to boom at the port. Since then, the port has continued to expand, allowing for larger and larger ships to enter the port. Today, the port continues to grow, and as we know, it is one of the fastest growing ports in the country. It'll be fun to watch what heights this port can reach in the future. Located roughly halfway between Houston and Corpus Christi is the Calhoun Port Authority's Point Comfort. Located in Lavaca Bay, the port has 5 deep water berths, 6 brown water berths for barges, and can handle dry bulk barges up to 740 feet long. The port's establishment can be pinpointed to the former town of Indianola in 1840. That port was successful for 40 years until Indianola and the port was abandoned after getting hit by many strong hurricanes. After Indianola's demise, a new port was made more inland. Large ocean-going ships began calling on this port in the early 1960s, and several improvements were made to the port, including dredging and jetties. There was a lot of scrutiny to the port and nearby companies in the 1990s due to mass amounts of pollution turning Lavaca Bay into a Superfund site in 1994. They had found out that one of the companies was dumping as much as 67 pounds of mercury in the bay for over 2 decades. This shut down the fishing industry and recreation within Lavaca Bay. This particular company owned up to their errors and said they would clean it up. After over 15 years of work, the bay was officially cleaned. Point Comfort is somewhat limited due to its operating depths of only 36 feet for ships. Because of this, the port is successful at being a major barge shipping port. Goods are transferred onto barges, which then use the Gulf Intracoastal Waterway to barge goods around the Gulf. Through the port's own railroad, the Point Comfort Northern Railway, they can connect to the Union Pacific Railroad line. Today, the main products moved are petrochemicals, crude oil, plastics, bauxite, and aluminum oxide. The Port of Corpus Christi set records in 2021 when it became the largest port in the U.S. in terms of total revenue tonnage, making an impact of over $150 billion in the United States. The top 3 commodities at the port were crude oil, petroleum, and liquid natural gas. During the Trump administration, many Gulf ports, including the Port of Corpus Christi, saw major growth with the allowed expansion of Permian Basin drilling, which saw oil production, LNG production, and pipelines branch out to Gulf Coast ports. For a handful of years before the next administration, the U.S. was completely energy independent and an exporter of energy to others. A major winner in this was the Port of Corpus Christi, which saw new railway infrastructure, 4 new pipelines, and got a fully funded project to expand and deepen their shipping channel to become the deepest on the Gulf Coast. The port became a key exporter of U.S. energy. Starting in 2019, over 3 million barrels a day of oil ran through the pipelines to the port to be then shipped off. In all, from the 6,843 vessels over the year of 2021, they handled over 167 million tons of cargo, a record for the port. The port also has 13 public liquid docks, as well as 16 private liquid docks. They also have 3 general cargo docks and 2 bulk facilities. Overall, there is 295,000 square feet of covered storage and 125 acres of open storage. They also have over 60 miles of rail at the port, including a large rail yard. Overall, it is the 3rd busiest port in terms of tonnage in the USA. To get to this size, the port's history took over 100 years in the making. After a devastating hurricane season in 1919, the city decided it was time to set up some better infrastructure to not have the impacts of the storms completely obliterate the local economy. The Port of Corpus Christi officially opened in 1926. By 1936, the main cargo transitioned from cotton to oil. As the docks filled up, a new industrial canal that was nearly 2 miles long was created and allowed for industrial development on both sides of the canal. Current projects for the port are the widening and deepening of the Corpus Christi ship channel, which will widen the channel to 530 feet and 54 feet deep. The port has been given a good hand and is capitalizing on this for a successful and prosperous future. All eyes are on the Port of Corpus Christi. The last port on our journey across the Gulf is the Port of Brownsville. It is Texas's southernmost deep-water port, which makes sense since it's only about 8 miles from the US-Mexico border. The port is centered around the Brownsville Ship Channel, which has a depth of 42 feet. Unique to this port, unlike others, is that this port not only serves southern Texas, but it is also a significant port for northeast Mexico's economy. On top of that, they have 13 cargo docks and 6 liquid cargo docks, with over 1 million square feet of covered storage and over 3 million square feet of open storage space. The port has rail connections to both the US and Mexico through 3 different railroad lines. As for the main commodities at this port, they are a bit different because they include steel products, various fuels, aluminum, grains, and green energy components, mainly windmills. The port's operations began in 1936. At that time, major commodities were cotton, grains, and tropical fruits. Cotton remained being the top product until about the 1950s. At that time, steel became the top commodity. Current plans for the port are deepening the ship canal to 52 feet from 42 feet, as well as continuing to improve their liquid cargo docks. The bulk docks were finished in 2019. Looking into the future, the port services traditional fuels as well as green energy in terms of windmill shipments. This port is another successful cog in what makes up an impressive team of seaports in the Gulf Coast. And there you go, a complete collection of seaports in the Gulf Coast. We went from Florida to Texas and every state in between to catalog and document every significant seaport. From Port Manatee to the Port of Mobile, over to the Port of New Orleans, and down to the Port of Brownsville. All of these seaports, no matter how small or how large, have varied histories and are a piece of the framework that make up the United States economy. I hope you enjoyed this series as we explored the entirety of the Gulf Coast. It has been my pleasure to present it to you. I want to encourage you to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications. Comments are greatly welcomed. And if you appreciate this kind of content, you can support us monetarily via our Patreon. Our channel is supported by viewers like you. So please, stay tuned for future seaport collections like this, and I look forward to seeing you all in the future. Thank you for watching Seaports of the Gulf Coast.